All right, so today we're diving into Algospeak.
Algospeak.
And I gotta say, it's a term that can sound a little shady. Like we're about to uncover some secret internet language.
Right.
But we're going deeper than that today.
Absolutely.
We're looking at how these digital euphemisms, we're talking everything from COVID-era tweets to, get this, presidential speeches, actually function.
It's fascinating stuff.
And we've got a great lineup of sources to pull from for this deep dive: academic papers, psychology articles, even a student essay that compares political speech to the Penn State scandal. It's going to be a wild ride.
I think what's most interesting here is how Algospeak isn't just about, trying to outsmart some algorithm. It's about how language itself evolves. Take the classic example, panini for pandemic. I mean, those memes were everywhere.
Oh, tell me about it. I remember feeling like every other tweet was about grabbing a panini and settling in for a Netflix marathon or something. At the time, it felt more like, finding some humor in a really crazy situation than some sort of conspiracy.
Right.
But then I was reading this analysis of online language during COVID, and I saw that even established news sites were using panini.
Really?
And that threw me for a loop. Are journalists really trying to manipulate us with, like, sandwich references? It just seems so strange.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. What the research suggests is that those news sources weren't using panini to mislead people, but to clarify.
Okay.
It was less about manipulation and more about creating a shared understanding, especially in those early days of the pandemic when no one really knew what was going on.
So are you saying they were basically saying, like, hey, remember that whole panini thing everyone's joking about? We're talking about the actual pandemic here?
Exactly. It's like using a cultural shorthand to try to explain something new and complex. And it's ironic when you think about it, algospeak itself is kind of a euphemism that academics use to discuss this very phenomenon.
Whoa. That is meta. But it makes sense, right? Because if we take a leap from panini to, say, Bill Clinton's 1995 speech on affirmative action, the student essay you shared, it analyzes how even presidents use these kinds of linguistic tactics. And it's anything but random.
What's really striking about political speech is how deliberate every word choice is. Euphemisms are often used to kind of soften the blow of controversy, maybe foster a sense of unity. Like, for example, in that Clinton speech, instead of directly addressing the opposition, he uses phrases like mend it, don't end it.
Mend it, don't end it.
Right. And by doing that, it subtly shifts the conversation away from completely dismantling affirmative action towards finding some sort of common ground.
So it's less about sounding polite and more about framing the entire debate on his terms.
Exactly.
Really makes you realize this isn't just some internet fad. It's about how language has always been used to persuade.
100%. And that power, as we'll see later with the Penn State case, can be used for good. Or, unfortunately, to downplay situations that really demand clear, direct language.
And that brings us to what might be the most unsettling example of euphemisms gone wrong: the Penn State scandal.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously what happened was horrific, but it was that student essay, the one analyzing the language used throughout the investigation, that really got to me.
I think what's so striking about that case is how these euphemisms, whether they were intentional or not, just sort of cascaded down the chain of command.
Right.
It's like a game of telephone, but with incredibly high stakes. And as information moved further and further away from the actual event, the language itself became more and more sanitized, almost like it was trying to obscure the need for urgent action.
Well, and you got this hierarchical structure, right? People in power maybe wanting to protect the institution, and suddenly sexual assault is being reported as, get this, horsing around.
Tearing around.
That's the phrase that jumped out at me from that essay. It's like, how can something so serious get so twisted?
It's really disturbing. That specific euphemism, and it was unfortunately used by multiple people in positions of authority, perfectly illustrates how language can be manipulated to downplay the severity of a situation. So instead of clearly communicating what was being alleged, which was criminal behavior, you have those in charge using language that minimizes the situation, ultimately delaying investigations and hindering justice for the victims.
It's like, at that point, it's not even about avoiding an uncomfortable conversation.
Right.
It's about actively dodging responsibility. And I think that's what makes this relevant to everyone listening.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've all encountered euphemisms in our workplaces.
Oh, yeah.
But this case really shows how dangerous they can be when what you need is clarity. Like this one time, I was in this meeting, and a colleague was describing a project, and it had completely gone off the rails, like missed deadlines, budget overruns.
The whole 9 yards.
Exactly. But instead of just coming out and saying it, he kept using these euphemisms like we're facing a few headwinds or we're navigating some unexpected turbulence.
Ah, classic corporate speak. It's like we're almost conditioned to reach for the softest language possible, even when it means obscuring the truth.
Right. And I'm sitting there thinking, just tell me how bad it is. But instead, we spent the whole meeting dancing around the real issues.
Well, and that's the danger, right? Euphemisms, they can create this illusion of control or progress, when in reality, things are much messier. And in your colleague's case, those euphemisms might have actually delayed some crucial intervention that could have saved the project.
Okay, so self-awareness is key. But what about when we're on the receiving end of these vague phrases, especially coming from, bosses, people in positions of power? How do we balance being respectful with making sure we're not getting like a sugar-coated version of events? That's the million-dollar question, right? How do you walk that line? You want to be respectful, but you also don't want to be left in the dark.
I think it really comes down to critical thinking. When you hear vague language, especially from someone in a position of authority, don't be afraid to, politely but firmly ask for clarification. Sometimes just saying something as simple as, could you give me a specific example of what you mean? Or what does that look like in practical terms? Those kinds of questions can really cut through the fog and get to the heart of the matter.
It's almost like you have to become like a language detective or something, analyzing every word.
In a way, yes. Because, as we've seen, those seemingly small word choices can have huge implications. And, sometimes those uncomfortable conversations, the ones we tend to shy away from, are actually the most important ones to have. Direct communication, used responsibly and respectfully, of course, it's really crucial for ethical and effective decision making. And that goes for both our personal and professional lives.
No doubt about it. This entire deep dive has been eye-opening. I mean, we started with something as like seemingly trivial as panini replacing pandemic online. And now we're talking about ethics and responsibility and the very nature of truth.
And that's the power of language, isn't it? It really does seep into every single aspect of our lives, shaping how we see the world, how we interact with each other. So the next time you encounter a euphemism, whether you're scrolling through tweets, listening to a political speech, or even just having a casual conversation, take a moment to really think about the why behind the words.
Absolutely. It's like you're reading between the lines.
Exactly.
So to sum this all up for our listeners, be mindful of your own language choices. Don't be afraid to question vague language and be willing to have those tough conversations when it really matters. It's all about finding that balance, right?
Yeah, between politeness and honesty. Without sacrificing clarity, just because it's easier to avoid the uncomfortable stuff.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Oh, for sure.
Well, on that note, I think that wraps up this linguistic deep dive. Until next time, everybody, happy exploring.